My name is Josh Baxter. I'm a writer and filmmaker, and the story I want to share began when my wife and I inherited an antique piano that had been in her family since the 1920s. We received the piano from our Aunt Marguerite. It's a 1902 Vos & Sons upright that had belonged to Marguerite's mother. As if the piano itself wasn't enough of a gift, it was the story that came with it that really captured our attention, and my interest as a filmmaker.
My mother was named Florence Elizabeth Rowe. My grandfather was a preacher, and I do remember her telling me that when she was young and her father would go to preach at area churches around Garland County, he would take her with a horse and buggy, and if the church had a piano, she would play and he would lead the singing along with preaching. And all three of her brothers sang with my mother. They sang for churches, but they also sang in homes and at parties. And one time, they were at the home of a man named Judge Huff, and the piano that my mother was playing had belonged to his daughter. By that time, his daughter had died. And he really liked the singing. He liked my mother, and apparently she reminded him of his daughter. And he told my mother that he wanted her to have his daughter's piano. And so this piano was very, very special to her because she had that, and it was hers, and it was her prized possession. And it stayed with her for the rest of her life.
I took an immediate interest in this story. It was such a fascinating snapshot into a small window of history in our hometown of Hot Springs, Arkansas. But who was Judge Huff? And even more, who was his daughter? My research began to open doors that had been closed since the summer of 1913. I discovered a grisly tale of murder, conspiracy, and mob justice as our heirloom piano began to reveal the secrets it had held for 100 years. I wanted to tell the story in a documentary film and began to dig deeper into the details. That's when I learned that the Huff family home was still standing in Hot Springs.
The Huff House was built in 1895 by Judge Huff, who was a rising politician here in Hot Springs, and it became his lifelong home.
They had 4 children and one daughter. Her name was Garland Huff, who was a pianist and was a favorite around town. There were some events that happened in this house that were tragic and that were very important to the history of Hot Springs and are still relevant today. And we hope that by telling Garland Huff's story in this house and bringing people back together, that we can kind of right some wrongs and visit our past and acknowledge the past. If you look in the newspaper, the Huffs would have, in the society page, all the musicians that they hosted here. There would be opera singers and pianists and traveling bands, and they were very famous for their musical tastes in the time.
As I got to know Cheryl and Zach, I learned that their purpose for the Huff House is to create a social venue for musicians and artists, much in the way the house was used a century ago.
Zach and I are musicians, and it just seems kind of magical to think of bringing back the spirit of the Huff musical showcases and the events that they would have here. I started playing the piano when I was 6 years old. Everywhere I go, it always comes back to a piano. So here we are again, and it still comes back to the piano, and finding the original piano from the family that built this house is so amazing.
For my film, I want to document the restoration of Garland's piano while telling her story and return it to the home it came from a century ago so it can resume its original purpose.
The Huff House has a lot of stories to tell. As we share it, as we bring that history forward, we want to have a place where we can gather together, creating that environment in the Huff House and bring Garland's piano home.